everyone. I'm Susan Douglas. I'm chair of the Department of Communication Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Marsh Lecture. The Marsh Lecture is delivered by our Marsh professor, and the Marsh professorship is made possible by the generosity of the Marsh family, which has endowed both research funds for our department and endowed a professorship for an eminent visiting faculty member who comes every year to teach for us. Oh, we need the mic on, right? Yeah. Okay, can you guys hear me? Could you hear me anyway? Okay. This year, our Marsh professor is Louisa Lim, and I am equally delighted to report that she has agreed to stay with us for a second year. She's been a big success. Her classes are enormously popular, and we're really happy that she's going to be staying with us for another year. Louisa Lim is a prize-winning journalist, including work on a Peabody Team Award, an Alfred DuPont Award, and 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards. She served as the BBC Beijing correspondent from 2003 to 2006, the NPR Shanghai correspondent from 2006 to 2010, and the NPR Beijing correspondent from 2010 to 2013. I'm sure many of you have heard her on NPR. Last year, before joining us, she was a Knight Wallace Fellow, and most recently, she is the author of The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. This book has debuted to rave reviews from the leading journals and magazines in our field. The New York Times described it as one of the best analyses of the import of Tiananmen throughout China since 1989. It was also called stunning, important, and The Economist named it one of the best books of 2014. Louisa is going to speak from that book tonight, so please join me in welcoming Louisa Lim.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your introduction, and thank you to Robin Nolan and all the faculty at the Communication Studies Department for welcoming me, and thanks also to the Marsh family for the chance to teach at this wonderful university. I'd also quickly like to thank all the students from my classes for turning up today. It's really nice to see you here. I'm going to talk about my book, which is called The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. It's really about how the events of 1989 changed China, and then how China went on to change them as it rewrote its own history. It's about amnesia, which one really famous Chinese author, Yan Lianke, called a state-sponsored sport. And my book is about the people who refused to take part in that state-sponsored sport and what happened to them for refusing to take part. So actually, in a way, this book is kind of a mistake. I never set out to write this book. In fact, I never set out to write any book. I was in China, I was working for NPR, and a publisher got in touch with me, an editor, and said, would you like to write a book about 1989 and its legacy? And my first thought was, no way, that would just be suicidal. I'd never get a journalist visa to again, you know, my career would be over. But then sort of bit by bit, the idea began kind of percolating, and I began to think, I began to wonder, why hasn't anyone written that book? And of course, the answer was obvious, for the same reasons that I was so reluctant to write it myself. And then also there was the journalistic challenge of writing a book about a subject where nobody thought there was anything new to say. So I decided that I would write a book, and I flew over to the US, and I signed a contract, and I flew back to China, and I went back to my job, and I began writing my book secretly. And, oh, this is not working. That was when I met this woman, Tang Deying, and she really changed my book. In the end, I ended up writing a completely different book than the book that was in my proposal, and it was because of her. I was in Chengdu, which is where she lives, more than 1,000 miles from Beijing. And I was reporting on another story when I met her. And we started talking, and then she told me about how she'd lost her son, how he'd been killed in the crackdown in 1989. And I was surprised. I didn't know that it had happened anywhere apart from Beijing. And she said, no, it had happened in Chengdu. And her son had died that day. He had been 17 years old, and he had been riding his bike back home when he disappeared, and she never saw him again. And to me, this was really extraordinary that there had been a whole other crackdown that I had never heard about, despite studying Chinese at university, despite having been a journalist in China for all those years. So she kind of set me off on a new path. I started to look for eyewitnesses who had been there, who had seen that crackdown in Chengdu. I started to look for photographs, for diaries, for government documents, both Chinese government documents and US government cables, and I started to try to put the pieces of that story together. And by the end of it, I came out with a completely different book than the one that had been in my proposal. But it was, I guess, the central question that I was tackling that really shocked me so much was this idea that how can an event that happened 25 years ago, an event that happened in living history, how can it be forgotten? You know, an event that happened within our lifetimes. And that was one of the first things that I set out to investigate. And one of the first things that I discovered was that memory is geographic. It depends on geography. So here in the West, whenever we talk about Tiananmen, it brings to mind this one iconic image. Ooh. The image of Tank Man. So just as a quick experiment, put your hand up if you've seen this image before. Okay, actually, let's do it the other way around. Put your hand up if you haven't seen that image before. Okay, so there's 2 people in this room. So that's probably less, you know, maybe 2 people out of, I'm really bad, maybe that's 5%. So just remember that for later. So many of us have seen that image. Ooh, sorry. But I think fewer people have seen the raw footage of that moment, which is also extremely powerful. In fact, a British playwright, Lucy Kirkwood, wrote an entire play about this moment. She said, this is a picture of the moment that China exchanged democracy for an economic miracle, for the opportunity to work, live, spend, and progress. But even 25 years on, there's much that even in the West is unknown and forgotten about this particular moment. This wasn't actually even June the 4th. This happened on June the 5th. And this has been forgotten. The fact that not only did he stand in front of the tanks, this young man, he climbed up and he exchanged words with the tank, with soldiers inside the tank. And nobody knows for sure what he said, but reports at the time said that he shouted, "Leave my people alone." And we also don't know who this man was, and we also don't know what happened to him afterwards. At the end of this footage, you see him being sort of bundled off by people on bikes, and it's not clear whether they're protecting him or arresting him. So this moment that is so iconic in the West is still, there's a lot about it that is not known. So this moment did not come in a vacuum. The first thing that happened was on April the 15th, 1989, when the former Communist Party secretary, Hu Yaobang, who had been deposed, he was a liberal and he had been deposed for his handling of student unrest a couple of years before. He died suddenly, and the students who felt sympathetic towards him because of his liberal tendencies, they came out to mourn. And very, very quickly, the act of mourning became an act of protest. The students began to hold banners saying things like, he who died should have lived, those who live should die, and things like that. And then the protests became calls for freedom, for democracy, protests against corruption, and for freedom of press and all these kinds of issues. And the protests began to grow. On April the 26th, the People's Daily ran an editorial where the protests were labeled as turmoil. So this was, for the student demonstrators, this was kind of a message that the government had already ruled against them. They took that to mean that whatever they did, they would be in trouble. And so this editorial actually had the effect of increasing the protests. And by early May, there were more than 1 million people on the streets of Beijing. And there were protests all around China, in almost every provincial capital and many other large cities as well. By mid-May, the students had gone on a hunger strike, and this really led to a lot of popular support for them as people watched students being rushed off to hospital. As this was going on, there was also a power struggle in the highest echelons of government, with the reformers and the conservatives pitted against each other. A week later, that was the last appearance of the Communist Party Secretary General Zhao Ziyang, who was seen as a reformer. And he made this appearance at 5 in the morning at Tiananmen Square, where he came and he said to the students, we have come too late. And then from that moment on until his death 15 years later, he was kept under house arrest. The next day, martial law was declared, and the government tried to send in troops. But this first attempt to declare martial law was not successful. And that was because the people came out to stop the troops from entering Beijing. They surrounded these convoys of army troops, and just sort of waves and waves of people. And then the people even spread out newspapers on the ground and lay down and slept in front of the wheels of the army trucks. And the trucks, the jeeps, the convoys, they were swamped and they were stuck there, sometimes for 3 days and 3 nights, until they could go back to the army bases. So they were called back to the army bases, and the students believed that it had been a great triumph. But of course, it was only a temporary win, a temporary gain. And as we now know, on the night of June the 3rd to June the 4th, the troops were sent in, 150,000 of them, to clear Tiananmen Square, no matter the cost. Now, we do not still know, even at this distance, how many people died that night. As was later discovered to be the case, many of the deaths were not in Tiananmen Square, but were on the approach roads leading to the square. And the original Chinese estimates were that 241 people died, but that figure is much too low. Later, the Swiss ambassador and the International Red Cross went around the hospitals, and they came up with an estimate that 2,600 people had been killed. But that was an estimate they later had to withdraw under political pressure. So to this day, we don't really know what happened, how many people died. That number is still unclear. So that's much of the background that has been forgotten in the West over the passage of time. Today, when you say 1989 or Tiananmen Square, I think this picture is really what remains in people's minds. And it's become, it's become really a meme, a part of popular culture, to the extent that we see it time and again in cartoons in the newspaper. Obama's first trip to China in 2009, and there he is portrayed as a squeegee man begging for a handout from the Chinese with their tanks. And again, in the same year, when there were protests in Iran by young people using Twitter and Facebook and social media to organize, this appeared. And you can see the protester is standing there with his BlackBerry tweeting, and the mullahs are saying he's twittering. And then 2 years ago, Edward Snowden fleeing to China. This appeared. So I really think that the whole notion of tank man has become an image which is so deeply embedded in our popular culture that it really doesn't need to be explained. If you ever had any doubt, then here is the Simpsons version of it. So, I mean, not only the Simpsons, but I know this might be hard to believe, but even popular advertising has appropriated the imagery of Tank Man. So here we go. So yes, I know it's hard to believe that Chick-fil-A really did do a Tank Man advert, but they really did. So, you know, part of my question was, if this image, if it is so well known in the West, then what about in China? I mean, surely people must have heard of it. Surely people nowadays must know this image. After all, we hear a lot about the growth of internet usage in China. There's 650 million internet users in China. And while there is a lot of censorship in China, it is also true that many of the young people who use the internet know how to navigate around those blockages to get the information that they need to know. So, you know, one of the things that I did when I was writing my book was I wanted to find out just how many young people in Beijing could identify this picture. So I went to the campuses of 4 Beijing universities, those that had been most instrumental in the 1989 protests. And I asked 100 students if they could identify this picture. And if they said yes, I would just double check to make sure that they really knew what it was. Now bear in mind, probably 95% of people in this room could identify this picture. In Beijing, only 15% of students could tell me what that picture was. And at first I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to be able to tell if people are lying to me. There's no way of knowing. But actually, very quickly I discovered that it was absolutely obvious who knew, because the power of that image in China was such that people who knew what the picture was, they would look at it and then they would actually have a physical reaction. They would draw away from it. Some of them would gasp. One boy said, "Oh my God." Someone else said, "I don't know what it is, but I can't talk about it because it's very sensitive." So, you know, it was clear he knew what it was. And people asked me questions. Someone said, "Is it South Korea?" Someone said, "Is it Kosovo?" Somebody else pointed out the lampposts, which are very, very distinctive. They only have lampposts like that in Tiananmen Square. And they said it looks like Tiananmen Square, but it can't be. And that was when I began to realize that people really did not know this image, especially young people. And the young people who did not know it, you could tell by their body language, because they would actually lean into the picture. And they would, you know, they would lean in and they would point things out and they would talk about it. So 85% could not identify the picture. And 19% actually believed that it was a military parade, because you do get military parades down Chang'an Avenue, the avenue that leads to Tiananmen Square. And this was the only incidents that they could think of tanks in the center of town. So that was when I realized just how successful the government has been, especially with young people, at really erasing the memory of something which happened within a generation. And of that 15% who did know what the picture was, it was interesting that quite a few of them actually went to great lengths to tell me that what the government had done was necessary, and that China would be much worse off today if the government hadn't taken such action back in 1989. This is really a retrospective justification based on China's 3 decades of economic growth. And it's actually a very mainstream view today, even among people who were protesting back in 1989. So that was one of the things that I learned. And the third thing that I learned from this experiment was just how nervous it made me. You know, I was terrified. I was convinced that I was going to be detained or arrested. The whole time that I was asking kids on campuses, you know, wandering around with this picture of Tank Man, you know, I had sweaty hands. And then I began to think about it, and I began to realize that I actually had a journalist card, which is a license to ask these questions. You know, I was just doing my job. So if I was so nervous to talk about 1989, what about ordinary people who were not journalists? And this is when I realized the extent to which I myself had internalized China's censorship. And it was an interesting moment. So why don't young Chinese people know about 1989? Well, I mentioned the internet, and the internet is, of course, very censored. So if you search for Tiananmen on Google, you will immediately get pictures of Tank Man and descriptions of what happened in 1989. If you search on the Chinese equivalent, Baidu, you get pictures of Tiananmen Square and tourist information about where the square is and this kind of thing. And we see every year all kinds of censorship of words that may have to do with 1989. So first it was just June the 4th, then it was May the 35th, even February the 65th. You know, last year words that were censored involved things like today, tomorrow, nostalgia, when spring turns to summer. Even 2 to the power of 6 was censored last year, because 2 to the power of 6 is 64, and in Chinese, 64, 64, is the way that you say June the 4th. So the internet is heavily censored. June the 4th is not taught in schools, and in universities, only if you're a history major might you study it. And in the textbooks that history majors use, out of 529 pages, only 4 are devoted to the events of June the 4th. And even that account contains what one French professor, Michel Bonin, called a monumental historical untruth. But you know, if you were a young Chinese kid, how would you possibly know that your textbooks are containing things that are not true? There would be no way of knowing. And I think that this has led to a real institutional amnesia. And we can see that from the way that certain things have appeared in government publications. So this is a picture of students who were shot in '89, being rushed to hospital on the back of a bicycle flatbed. And interestingly, this appeared in a government newspaper, the Xinjiang Bao, in 2009. And the reason that it appeared was that no one working at the newspaper, you know, not the picture editor or the art editor or the page editor or even the censor of the newspaper, no one actually recognized what this picture was, and so no one knew that it was sensitive enough to censor. So I would really say that's an example of this, both the success and the failure of the Chinese government's sort of campaign of amnesia. I think that it's been so successful that in many cases the institutional memory of June the 4th is gone, and people no longer know what to censor. And this attempt to control the press, it's not just the Chinese press that have pressure put on them. Even Western press working in China come under pressure, especially around the anniversary, in the way not to cover, they're told not to cover June the 4th or to cover it in certain ways. And I was just going to play you this quick clip which shows one example of this, possibly the most bizarre example of press handling ever. So this was the 20th anniversary, 2009. And that year, if you work for a TV station, you do often get given permission to go to Tiananmen Square to do your stand-up. You get given a card and you can film there, for 20 minutes between this time and that time, and you'll watch the whole time. And that year, when the Western press went to film there, they discovered a new security innovation to stop them from doing their pieces to camera. So I like to think of it as the umbrella men of Tiananmen Square. This is the BBC correspondent, James Reynolds. This is the CNN correspondent, John Voss. And I mean, it can seem like extremely puerile behavior, but this is not the behavior of a government which is at peace with its own actions. And I should say that in the last year, that in 2014, the attempts to stop Western media from reporting on June the 4th were even more blatant. Journalists were just visited at their offices by policemen and told, you must not go to the square on June the 4th. You must not report on June the 4th. If you are, there will be consequences which we will not talk about. So why is it so important to China's leaders? I mean, I think one of the reasons why June the 4th is still so relevant today is because China's leaders know that the demands that the protesters made are more pressing than ever today. I mean, this is an era where the corruption cases are not for millions of dollars, but billions, tens of billions of dollars. And the legacy of Tiananmen really leaves the party vulnerable, which is why it has gone to great lengths to stop people from talking about or remembering Tiananmen in any public fashion. And we saw that more than ever this year. In 2014, 152 people were arrested or detained or placed under house arrest in the pre-anniversary clampdown, which was the worst for many, many years. People like this man, Sheng Guang, who is a Buddhist monk who was hauled off while he was giving a Buddhist lecture in a Shangri-La hotel, and he is still in prison accused of incitement to subversion. And everyone who was listening to his lecture was also arrested. This young man is a factory worker, and he just happened to take a selfie on the square, which you're looking at, making the V sign that was made by the students back in 1989. And for that, he was detained for creating a public disturbance, which is really the catch-all offense that has been used in the last year more and more for people for whom no other more sort of specific crime can be found. This is someone I profile in my book, Zhang Xianling. She is the mother of a 19-year-old boy who was shot by the troops in 1989. And she co-founded the Tiananmen Mothers, which became the first grassroots lobbying group in China. This last year, on the 15th of May, she was one of 15 people who held a seminar, which was June the 4th commemoration symposium. And it was held inside a private apartment, inside someone's house. So within a couple of days of that picture being taken, 5 out of the 15 people who were there had been detained on charges, again, of creating a public disturbance, which is kind of hard to do when you're meeting in a private place, but there you go. And one of the people in the picture, the lawyer Pu Zhiqiang in the bottom right-hand corner, is still detained to this day. This is someone else who I profile in my book. His name is Chen Guang. And back in 1989, he was a 17-year-old soldier. And he was one of the soldiers that was deployed to the square to clear the square, whatever the cost. And afterwards, he became an artist. And he painted pictures, his memories of the scene that night, the memories that he couldn't forget. Last year, he had an art performance, and he invited about 24 people to this performance. It was in a private studio, and basically, he painted dates on the walls, starting in 1989 and going all the way to 2014, and then he whitewashed the walls. His point, as he put it, history is like a blank, it has been wiped out. So, for that act, he was detained and held by police for 6 weeks. So this was not an easy book to write. Even when I was writing it, I knew that it would be hard and very, it's always hard to know where the lines are because there are no lines in China. Something which was fine last year might be suddenly, completely illegal the next year, and no one is going to tell you what's safe and what isn't safe. So it was a very difficult book to write, and a lot of people took a lot of risks in order to talk to me. And I took a lot of precautions when I was writing the book. So I wrote the entire book on a laptop that had never been online, that I locked into a safe at night in my apartment, and I didn't tell hardly anyone that I was writing the book. I lived in a diplomatic compound, which is widely believed to be bugged. So I never spoke about the book at home. I never spoke about the book in the office. I never emailed about it. And for months, I didn't even tell my children that I was working on a book because I thought they might tell someone. And when I decided that I was writing a different book than the book that I had told my editor I was writing, there was actually no way that I could even communicate to my editor that I was writing a completely different book. So I waited for months until I left China, and then I rang him up to tell him, the good news is I've written quite a lot. The bad news is it's a completely different book than the book you were expecting. So he was surprisingly okay with it. I think he was just relieved that there was a book. But I think nowhere has history been wiped out more than in Chengdu, the city that I first mentioned, where nobody really had ever written in great depth about the crackdown that happened there. It's more than 1,000 miles from Beijing. It's the spot in the middle of the picture that you can see there. And so I started to collect as much material as I could with a lot of help from the very patient librarians here in Michigan. And I also, by the end, I had more than 1,000 photographs that had been taken by people who were there and kept. And these are some of the pictures that people sent me of the protests in Chengdu, which were huge, and included people from government-run work units. And as in Beijing, the protesters occupied a square in Chengdu, and they launched their own hunger strike at the foot of that square, at the foot of the Chairman Mao statue that overlooked that square. And that square, Tianfu Square, was known as Little Tiananmen because so many people had turned out. And demonstrating was so common in Chengdu that people, instead of saying, "Have you eaten?" which is a really common greeting in China, they would say, "Have you demonstrated yet?" On the morning of June the 4th, when the army cleared the square in Beijing, they also cleared the square in Chengdu. And in Chengdu, it was relatively peaceful. But after that, the people came back out on the streets again. And this time they were protesting against the crackdown in Beijing. And these pictures are taken on June the 4th. You can tell because the slogans in the photographs say things like June the 4th massacre, 7,000 people dead and injured. And they marched through the streets carrying these funeral flowers and signs saying things like, "We are not afraid of death." And the People's Armed Police were sent in, the paramilitary troops, and they used water cannons and tear gas. It was the first time it had ever been used in Chengdu to try to disperse the crowds. But very, very quickly, this disintegrated into really kind of pitched battles in the streets. And you can see some pictures of the fighting. People were ripping up paving stones. They were throwing bottles and anything that they could lay their hands on at the police. And to me, this picture is interesting because if you blow it up, you can see quite clearly the methods that the police used. You see the man kneeling in the middle of the picture and the policeman with his truncheon, his baton. And they, in order to put down the protests in Chengdu, they did not, to begin with, open fire. They beat people, and they beat people round the head. And they beat them really quite brutally. And I was sent pictures from inside hospitals, which were really interesting because you could see the preponderance of head wounds, just how many people were coming into the hospitals with head wounds. And I was also sent a secret report by a Communist Party member who went round the hospitals and who interviewed people. And he had been so angered by what he saw that he wrote this secret report and he smuggled it out. And the government in Chengdu, it couldn't hide what had happened because the geography of Chengdu was such that there were so many witnesses. It was impossible to deny what happened. So they took a different tack. They actually filled the information space. They released a book which is called The Whole Story of the Chengdu Riots. Just a month later, 700,000 copies of this book were released, putting forward the government's version of what happened. And in that book, they admitted that people had been killed in Chengdu, 8 dead, they said, including two students, and 1,800 people were injured, most of them policemen. But I was shocked to find that this was probably not the bloodiest or the most shocking event that happened in Chengdu. After that, there was this really acts of retaliation by people who were so angered by the brutality that they started burning down state-owned property. And this had once been a department store, which took up an entire city block, and it was burnt down. And a lot of buses and police vehicles and state-owned property was also targeted on the night of June the 4th. And by the next morning, the police were so outnumbered that they actually had to withdraw from the streets, and they lost control. And then a lot of what happened after that, I was able to find both from eyewitnesses, but also from reports like this. This is a US diplomatic cable because the US had a consulate in Chengdu, and they sent cables describing exactly what happened. So the US consulate was based at this hotel, the Jinjiang Hotel, and it still exists today, and it's a very swanky hotel today. But back then, it was the smartest hotel in Chengdu. And on the night of June the 5th to June the 6th, a crowd tried to break into the hotel, and they began ransacking a shop in the lobby. And police were called in, and they restored order to the hotel in a very, very brutal fashion. So there were a lot of Westerners staying in the hotel, a lot of Americans, and they, many of them saw from their rooms in the front of this hotel, they watched how the police restored order. They saw these protesters, lines and lines of protesters, first being made to kneel in rows in the courtyard, and then having their hands tied or wired behind their back. Some people said they were wired in a way that would have had to require their arms to be broken. Plainclothes policemen walked along the lines of the kneeling men, and when an order was given, the policemen went round and they beat the protesters, smashing their skulls with iron rods. 2 trucks pulled in, and the bodies were thrown into the trucks like garbage, like sacks of potato, like slabs of meat, like carcasses. Those are 4 different descriptions from 4 different witnesses, and none of them knew that anybody else had seen what they saw until 25 years later. One person said, "I don't remember anyone screaming. There was no noise, just the bodies piling up on top of each other. There were definitely lifeless bodies. I imagined if anyone was alive, they would not survive in that pile." I really wanted to find out what had happened that day, so I went back to the Chinese sources to see if they had any mention of this. And actually, there was a lot written about this actual event. In the book that I showed you, The Whole Story of the Chengdu Riots, they said that 70 people were detained at that hotel that day. And in the newspaper reports of the Sichuan Daily of that morning, they even described how police had used violence against protesters. But as for answers, I really don't have any answers. Were all 70 people killed? I don't know for sure. Too many years have passed for me to give any easy answers. All I know is that the people who I interviewed, the eyewitnesses to this, they believed that they were witnessing an atrocity, and many of them were very, very traumatized. I also knew from the Chinese reports that the descriptions they'd given really looked like the pictures that were shown in the Chinese propaganda. Just the methods they used of people being rounded up, being forced to kneel down with their hands tied, and being thrown face first on the ground. These were all things that were pictured in Chinese propaganda photos that these foreigners had never seen, because all of the eyewitnesses that I spoke to were repatriated to their own countries immediately after June the 4th. So I was still left with all these questions. Could all of these people died and no one known about it? And that really took me back to Tang Deying, the woman that I spoke about right at the beginning, because she had found out very early on that her son had been beaten to death in police custody. And she really wanted to find out more. She wanted to find out exactly how she died. So for the past 25 years, she has been on this quest to try and find out what happened to her son. She visited Beijing 5 times. She was sent back every time. She was detained. She was beaten. Twice she was locked in an iron cage. And she had a police car stationed outside her house for 2 whole years. After 11 years of petitioning in 2000, her persistence had this really surprising result. She was given by the police chief, the local police chief, she was given a photograph of her son's corpse. And he was dead, he was lying on a concrete floor, and there was blood around his nose and his mouth. His nose was bruised and his face was very swollen and uneven. It was very clear that he had been beaten. And one eye was open, and when she looked at it, she fainted because she thought that her son was looking at her even in death. In the year 2006, she was actually given a payment, almost $9,000, and it was the first payment ever made in China in connection with a 1989 death, although it was not couched as compensation, rather as a hardship allowance. So I was sure that someone like that, someone who had fought so hard and at such great cost to herself, that she would have some answers as to what had happened in that hotel courtyard. And I went back to her and I asked her, well, were there other people like you who lost children or who lost loved ones that day and who never found out what had happened to them? And she looked at me straight in the eye and she said, even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. And that was when I realized just how deep the silence is. When someone who has fought for so long, if she could not talk openly about what happened, then who would? And this is why I believe that forgetting isn't really something that is imposed from above. It's something that people have cooperated and colluded with. They have actively chosen to forget because it's so inconvenient to remember the events of June the 4th in Chengdu, in Beijing, or anywhere else. I mean, there's no benefit to memory in China today. There's only a very great cost. And I'm just going to tell you one last story. This is an artist called Sheng Qi. He was not in Tiananmen Square in '89, but he was really sympathetic to the protesters. And he was in his hometown when the killings happened. And he was so shocked and appalled by what happened that he said that it was almost as if he had lost his mind. And in this one kind of incredibly brutal act, he took a meat cleaver and he chopped off his own little finger as an act of protest. And then for many years, he used his mutilated finger in art. Now he has a 12-year-old son. And so I asked him, when I was interviewing him, I just asked him, well, what do you tell your son about what happened to your finger? And he said, well, you know, actually, most of the time I just tell him that I left my finger on the bus. And I said, well, you know, that's crazy. He's 12. Of course he doesn't believe you. And he said, I know he doesn't believe me, but I'm always thinking up some kind of story because he's still a little kid and I want to protect him. And that is how people feel. They feel that their children need protecting from the truth in order to survive and in order to thrive. And there are people who argue that what happened in Chengdu on June the 4th, or what happened in Beijing, does it really matter anymore? Does it really matter now that China has become so rich and so powerful? It has lifted so many people out of poverty. All of that is true, but I would argue that history matters. And it matters so much to China's own government that it's willing to spend all this money, all these resources, muzzling people like Tang Deying, who really only wanted to find out what happened to her son. As I said before, the cover-up is not just from the top. Memory, after all, is such a personal space. It is in your own head. But people have allowed themselves to become party to this state-sponsored amnesia. As one dissident who I interviewed said, a massive secret has become a massive vacuum. And I'm going to end by paraphrasing her words. She said, the crimes of the state are slowly being replaced by the crime of silence. And that is a crime in which almost everyone is complicit. Thank you. So, questions, comments, please.
Louisa, did you come across any examples of parents who did tell their children?
There are some parents who have told their children, but many parents have found it really difficult to justify that to themselves because they worry so much about the impact it could have on their children. So in China, there's an exam called the Gaokao, which is like the high school entrance exam into university. And it also kind of functions like an ideological test. In order to pass the Gaokao, you have to pass all the political sections of the exam. If you write the wrong thing on the exam paper, you won't go to university. And I think a lot of parents feared the impact on their kids' future if their children should start having, inconvenient feelings towards the government. Maybe they would write the wrong thing on the Gaokao paper, maybe it could have all these consequences. They would end up not going to university, they would become a migrant worker, and they would have ruined their child's future. And of course, it's in cities, the one-child policy is still in effect. So that single child is so important, not just as a child, but also economically. That one child will later on be expected to support 6 people, 2 parents, 4 grandparents. And so these are all factors that need to be weighed up, if you were someone who took part. I think nowadays you do get some people when their kids go overseas to study. I've heard from a few people who've come to my talks that they heard after they went overseas, but their parents don't talk about it in great detail. They just know their parents were there, they don't know what their parents did. So some parents do talk about it, but I think many choose not to.
Thank you. Following up on that point, I was wondering more of the students who did go overseas, what you're hearing from them, even if they didn't learn it from their parents, but what their views on Tiananmen are. Do they feel like more people should know about it?
It's an interesting question. I mean, now the US has more students from mainland China than anywhere else, and it's also the biggest, fastest growing set of overseas students. And at the beginning, people believed that when Chinese students came overseas, that it would kind of liberate their minds and they would become, they would learn all these new things and they would go back kind of illuminated with all these new viewpoints. In some cases that has happened, but in many cases that has not happened. So what happened after '89 was Deng Xiaoping decided that what had gone wrong was that the students didn't know enough about how bad China used to be. They didn't really understand what the Communist Party had done. So they introduced this massive program called patriotic education. It's probably the biggest ideological campaign in human history. And so it's not just through textbooks, it's also through newspapers, films, the media in general. And there's a lot of thought work done about China. It's produced this younger generation that is quite nationalistic or patriotic. They're quite patriotic, sometimes even nationalistic. And in many cases, these students have come overseas, and when they hear other viewpoints on Chinese history, they simply find it really, really hard to accept that there could be any other viewpoint. And because they've been so schooled in this sort of model of the Chinese view of history, they often believe that this is kind of like, it's a Western campaign, that this is, falsehood, and this is meant to undermine China, and it's designed, a sort of Western plot designed to bring down China. And there have been some quite famous cases. In 2006 in MIT, there was actually a case where there were these professors teaching a course called Visualizing Cultures, where they used Japanese woodblock prints from the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to show how woodblock prints were used to build hatred amongst Japanese against Chinese in the context of the war. But some Chinese saw these prints and they believed, because one of the professors who taught the course had a Japanese name, they believed that it was anti-Chinese propaganda, and there were death threats. There were, the Chinese Student Association made all kinds of demands that these materials should be withdrawn from the syllabus altogether. And there was a huge uproar about this. So I think it's not a simple question to answer. In some cases, students have come overseas and found that what they heard overseas has made them more nationalistic. But in other cases, you do get students who come overseas and discover all this new information they never even thought about before and find it deeply shocking. And I've had people who've come to my talks who've just been completely blown away. They find it so hard to understand why they didn't know any of this stuff before. So I think it will be interesting to see in future what happens when those people go back to China, what kind of effect it has on them being in the US.
We have another question.
Actually, I don't have a question. I just have a comment because I'm a freshman from mainland China. I actually want to say that actually my history teacher taught us this in middle school, even though it's not on textbook. But still, she will taught us and told me this thing happened. Even though it's not published, of course we have to close the door to talk about this event. But still, I believe in many schools this event has been taught, even though it's not through government. Even though government censorship definitely eliminated abundant details of the event, but still, I think people talk about it, and lots of my friends around me actually know what happened on that day, even though indeed, parents rarely taught their children about it because I think they're still impacted by that event. But from the perspective of us, a young generation, I think it's actually a historical fact that we all recognize. So I think there will be people remembering this, and it's hard to gather in the fact and to read and to actually keep these memories going on. Of course, I feel I deeply appreciate that you wrote this book, but I do believe that from the perspective of the young generation, we will not totally forget about it. I'm pretty sure about it.
Thank you. Can I ask, where did you go to school? Was it in a city?
Yeah, it's in a big city.
Yeah, I think it's a little different in the city and in the countryside. I think urban kids are much more likely to know about this kind of thing than people who are not in major urban centers.
Yeah, that might be the issue, but still, there are lots of growing major cities in China right now, especially on the East Coast, Southeast Coast, there along lines. So I think maybe a 1/4 or 1/3 of people, young generation, know about it. Maybe that's my guess.
Yeah.
Is there any acknowledgement or reaction from the Chinese government or the media or official sources on this book?
Well, it's difficult for them to respond, I think, because I really tried to use as much archival material and material from government sources as possible, because I wanted to have as much detail as possible about what happened in 1989 in Chengdu. And I thought it's harder for the government. They would have to either confirm or deny if they make any response. And to deny would be to say, well, actually what we wrote back then was not true. To confirm would be to admit that there were people killed in places other than Beijing. So I think silence was the easier option. There was the only actual response that there was from there was a really nice review in the Economist magazine, which was two pages. And when that magazine appeared in China, every single page which had a review of my book had been ripped out of it. So that was the response. Fitting, perhaps.
So could you go back to China and be a journalist now?
I haven't tried, so I don't know. I hope to go back at some point in the future. It might not happen for a while. I'm not sure whether I could get a visa right now. I mean, we know that academics that have written about subjects deemed sensitive have been blacklisted. And there was this quite a famous case a few years ago when 13 academics who wrote a book about Xinjiang in northwestern China were blacklisted for many years just for contributing to an academic book. So I haven't tested. I don't know at the moment. I hope that I will be able to go back at some time.
Hi, my name is Coco. I'm from Hong Kong. I just want to get back to the girl at the back's opinion. She talked about how the younger generation actually knows about the event. I actually have a lot of friends from mainland China here, and then I try to talk to them about this event and try to see if they actually know what happened. And what I got back is they actually know what happened, but they know this event, but they don't know the details of it. They don't know why people were protesting. They don't know how the government wrapped it up, and they don't know how the government did all of the follow-up jobs to try to eliminate the history. And my definition of eliminating history is not just making it blank. It's also about changing facts and changing the thoughts, people's thoughts about that. And that's also an important thing, that even though people know about this event, what do they think about it? And what is the mainstream thought the government is trying to illustrate? And I also have a question is, so currently the government publications and also the news media seems like they're having a lot of differences in what they report. Why do you think the public will have no doubt against it, or why do you think they won't question anything about it? Thank you.
Let me come back to your first point first. I think one thing that's very important in the way that people, how people remember what happened is actually to do with the control of language, the use of authoritarian language. By labeling the protests as counter-revolutionary riots, that immediately defined the language that people could use in public to refer to it. And that in turn led to the people remembering it in that way. And I think over the years, those labels have changed slightly, but as the labels change, then the way people remember what happened changed. So it started as counter-revolutionary riots, then it became riots, then it became political storm. And now, if ever June the 4th is mentioned in the Chinese press, it's called the Tiananmen incident. And an incident is such a bland term. It just doesn't in any way conjure up the kind of, images of people being killed by, unarmed civilians being opened fire upon. But I think that the use of language and the control of language has been a really important tool for the government in China over the years and still today. As for its control on the press, I think people don't. The problem is that there are ever more restrictions put on how the Chinese press can report stuff. So if you are a journalist working in China, no matter how good your intentions are, you are very limited in what you can report. And I think that in recent years, that space has become even more limited over time. The Chinese government has introduced all these new regulations, which mean that journalists cannot, in the past, maybe if someone had found a great story, they might have reported what they could in their outlet and then perhaps used Weibo, Chinese Twitter, to report the rest, or perhaps passed it on to a foreign journalist who they knew could report it, or used other methods, or written about it on a blog. But nowadays, all new regulations governing the press mean that all of those ways of trying to report stuff are now being closed off, and they will be punished. So I think the Chinese press is really very limited in what it can do. I mean, I don't think that everybody believes what they read in the Chinese press. I think, you only need to go on Weibo, on Chinese Twitter, and you will find an awful lot of cynics. But at the same time, there are people who read the press at face value as well. I mean, the problem is the press, even the official press, even if it has very little credibility, there isn't really anything else to fill in the gap. So you just have these big credibility gaps and a lot of rumors sort of sloshing around that nobody knows whether to believe or not. And so you have this really odd position where really nobody knows what the truth is because no one really believes the official media, but they don't also completely believe other reports as well. So I think in terms of information, it's a difficult environment to be in because there's so much that is just unknown and hinted at and rumored and gossiped.
I just wanted to say that this is actually a longer process that we have to sort of examine more. I mean, this did happen in 1989. This wasn't a long time ago. This was fairly recent. A similar event happened in Korea in March 1st. Over 150 of the protesters were beaten by Japanese imperialists. This was covered up in the media. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Not a lot of people took pride in it, but after about 60 or 70 years, which is fairly short in historical terms, it has actually changed. And I don't think the discussion about whether the public is aware or isn't aware, or whether the media is aware or isn't aware, I think it's the people that actually matters. And I think the students that are sitting here, who actually know of what you're talking about, I think that is the ray of light of hope that we can actually look to. And secondly, I think if you want more personal narratives or any kind of more additional information about that, I think you can look outside of China and also into Korea or any kinds of more Asian countries where I think it was after this 1989 incident, and I've worked at this political refugee center for over 5 to 6 years, and I've actually talked to a few people that were actually in these riots and who are actually willing to talk more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're right that we should be hopeful that young people overseas are learning about it and are talking about it and telling people. And that's one thing that I have found really interesting since my book came out, that I had a number of emails from young Chinese students overseas that really made me hopeful. So there was one undergraduate who actually translated my entire book just by himself off his own back because he wanted other young Chinese to read about it. And then a couple of weeks ago, I got another email from a young undergraduate at MIT also asking whether they could translate my book so that it could be circulated among young Chinese. And to me, that's a really positive sign.
We have time for one more question, if there is one.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm from Hong Kong as well. I'm just trying to ask a question in a more global perspective. Over the past 30 years or 20 years, Hong Kong people are trying to, every year they went to the gathering for the June 4th movement to be commemorating the people who fight for the democracy in China. But after the Umbrella Revolution last year happened, fewer Hong Kong people will go to this kind of event. How do you think the Chinese government will act? What do you think the Chinese government will try to respond to this kind of phenomenon? Because people go to the gatherings because they love China, right? But fewer people go there, but they just care about Hong Kong. What do you think? What do you think this kind of relation?
Do you think, I don't know though, do you really think fewer people will go? I'm not sure whether that's the case. It often seems to me that there's a correlation between, Hong Kong is the only place on mainland soil where they have these big vigils every year. And I mean, what is really striking about the vigils is that many of the people, probably most of the people who turn out are really young, right? Often it's people who were not alive in 1989. And to me, it seems that coming out to the vigils in Hong Kong is also a way of defining what it means to be from Hong Kong, that you still have the freedom to do that, and that this is a freedom worth defending by continuing to go out every year and continuing to make sure that what happened in 1989 is marked and commemorated on Chinese soil. So to me, it often seems like there is a correlation in years where there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Hong Kong with Chinese policies, more people turn out at the vigils. So I don't know whether fewer people or more people will turn out after the Umbrella Revolution, the Umbrella Movement, but I do think that Hong Kong people do have a very distinct sense of what it means to be from Hong Kong and what sets them apart from mainland China. And I think one of the things that does set Hong Kong apart is memory. It's being able to remember and being able to commemorate publicly. And I hope that that's something that young Hong Kong people will continue to do, no matter what happened in the Umbrella Movement, because I think more and more people from China do hear about those vigils. You know, it's surprising the number of mainland Chinese that come over the border just before June the 4th in order to see these vigils and in order to ask, well, what really happened? And sometimes in order to take part in these vigils. So I think they're really important, and I hope more people will go. Thank you.
So on that hopeful note, please join me in thanking Louisa for a terrific talk.